I am very excited to introduce our next guest on Consumer Choice Radio. Flemming Rose is a Danish journalist, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He was previously the foreign affairs editor and the culture editor for Jyllands-Posten in Denmark. And he is quite notably one of the individuals involved and implicated in the Jyllands-Posten Muhammad cartoons controversy that kind of swept the world years ago. Flemming Rose, thank you very much for joining us on Consumer Choice Radio.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great. And so how has life been in Denmark throughout COVID? How is everything? You're based in Copenhagen, correct?
I'm based in Copenhagen, yes.
Yeah, so what is life like in Denmark right now?
Well, life is pretty nice. Denmark has reopened almost completely. But we were also one of the first countries to go into lockdown. I mean, there are disagreements about the pace and the range of this lockdown. We have a social democratic government, left of center, and their voters are primarily not among, private businesses, and you might say that they have been looking more after their own voters than after small and medium-sized private businesses. But that's about details and speed and how comprehensive you think this needs to be. But basically, Denmark has done pretty well. I don't think it's so much due to the government, but it's a question about individual discipline and securing physical distancing and going into quarantine if you have symptoms and not mixing with the public and things like that. So Denmark has very few cases, in fact, at the moment, and I think for some time no registered deaths with COVID-19 for quite some time.
Yeah, you're very lucky. It's much like Austria. I think we're doing pretty good. Flemming, of course, we would not be here if we did not plug your book, The Tyranny of Silence, How One Cartoon Ignited a Global Debate on the Future of Free Speech. Thankfully, I have mine signed, actually. I'm very lucky.
So do I.
Yeah, very good. One thing we wanted to ask you, Flemming, is to kind of give a background, because I think it's a very interesting moment in that we've been locked in our homes. We've kind of migrated our lives online, and people are paying attention to media and to global affairs, I think, more now than they might have ever had. Maybe the last time was 9/11, the last time that we paid attention this much. Just to go back to your book, and we want to get into the bigger thesis of it and kind of the story, but if you could just give the listeners who might not be familiar with you just a quick synopsis as to how you rose to prominence, why your name is so well known, and why you've had security details that have been following you the last couple of years, and why many might view you in the journalism profession.
I would say almost 15 years now.
Yeah.
But on and off. Well, for the past 5 years, I have lived with security around the clock, 24/7, and that was after the attack in Paris on Charlie Hebdo. That changed the whole, security landscape in Europe. From 2005, the time of the publication of the cartoons, until 2015, I had security on and off. But since 2015, it's been a permanent feature of my life. But I'm trained as a foreign correspondent. That was my profession, and I graduated in Russian language and literature. I worked at the Danish Refugee Council with refugees from the former Soviet Union, Jews first and foremost, Jewish immigration. through that work, I got in touch with dissidents and people in exile, people who had spent time in labor camps and in prison for dissenting from Marxism, Leninism, or being critical of the Soviet regime. And these people became the heroes of my life, and it's been a point of reference. My outlook and my understanding of the world is very much informed by my experience with dissidents and my life in the Soviet Union. I was there as a student at the height of the Cold War. So fast forward, I came back to Denmark in 2004 after having spent 14 years as a foreign correspondent in Moscow and in Washington, D.C. And I'm the culture editor, and then we have a debate about self-censorship when it comes to the coverage of Islam in Danish and European culture. Plays being taken off, exhibitions being cancelled, editors who are afraid of being critical of Islam. And we have this children's book in Denmark about the life of the Prophet, and the writer goes on record saying, I've written this book, but I had big difficulties finding an illustrator for my book. And to me, that reminded me of what I had seen in the Soviet Union. In fact, in the beginning of the Soviet regime, you had a lot of violence, and you have, dissenters being killed, mass killings. But at the time when I lived there, you had a lot of surveillance, but dissidents who were willing to speak their minds, maybe they were just a couple of hundred people or 500,000 people, because everybody had internalized and self-censored, so they did not break with the official party line. And that's the way a dictatorship functions. You intimidate the public space, and people internalize the unwritten rules. You might have freedom of expression on the books, but but you intimidate and prosecute people for expressing the wrong opinions. And I was not sure at the time whether this self-censoring going on with this children books was based in a real fear, a fear that was based in reality, or it was just a fiction of illustrators' mind that they were afraid of what might happen to them if they say or do something. So they were the questions that were on my mind when I, in order to approach this story, invited members of the Danish Cartoonist Association to draw the prophet as they see him. An open, very neutral invitation, and following a classical journalistic principle, don't tell, show. Before I invited the cartoonist, we have had several stories about this incident in my newspaper and in other newspapers. So this was part of a follow-up exercise. And to me, it was a classical journalistic exercise in the sense you hear about a problem. In this case, is there self-censorship or not when it comes to the coverage of Islam? And you want to find out if it's true or not. And I just, we just chose maybe an unorthodox way of approaching this story by inviting cartoonists to show through their medium of work how they relate to this problem. And I received 12 cartoons out of, I think, 25 from about 25 active members of this association. And 2 weeks later, we published this full page, and I wrote a short text outlining the motivation and with a reference to my experience in the Soviet Union, where you could go to jail for telling a joke. And yeah, the rest is history.
And so, obviously life changed very much for you after the crisis. I mean, embassies were burned. There were mass protests.
Yeah, but
Um,
that was only, in fact, 4 months later.
mhm, mhm.
In the beginning,
Yep.
it was pretty quiet, but within a week or two, there was a demonstration in Copenhagen. Um, I mean, it was a majority of them were Danish Muslims,
Mhm.
but there was no call for violence. It all came later when some of the imams representing the Muslim community in Denmark, they traveled to um, Lebanon and Egypt and later to Mecca to make their case to Muslim majority countries in order to put pressure on the Danish government.
Mhm.
That only happened in January 2006. The cartoons were published in September 2005.
And so, I mean, this is a good segue to kind of two moments that you've already mentioned in your life. The first being the cartoon crisis, and the second being the Charlie Hebdo attack. When, I mean, post Charlie Hebdo attack, the world appeared to rally around the concept of free expression, the ideas that the idea that words do not deserve a response with violence, and that ideas, including and especially religious ideas, deserve to be put under a microscope and in some senses ridiculed or made fun of, which is their brand. What do you think has happened since 2015 and those attacks and the global response, and where we see that censorship and that mentality kind of manifest itself today? Where do you think we went astray between then and now?
In fact, um, a, a week after the Charlie Hebdo attack, I think 4 million people marched in Paris, and among them global leaders. But I was very skeptic already at that moment because I had lived the cartoon crisis, and it was a kind of Diana moment. I think, in the sense that you can go out and you can show support by marching through the streets of Paris for one day. But the real test is when you get back into the newsrooms and you have to make editorial decisions. And it turned out, quite quickly, the support for Charlie Hebdo evaporated when it comes to specific decisions about what to publish and not to publish. And I would say that in Europe today, and not only Europe, I think we have an unwritten blasphemy law, in the sense that even though we don't have blasphemy laws in the books, we have it in real life because people are afraid of publishing cartoons ridiculing the Prophet Muhammad. It's not because I think it's nice and maybe also always the right thing to do, but it's just part of European tradition. Religious satire was part and parcel of the Enlightenment and the challenging of the dominance of the Catholic Church in Europe several hundred years ago. And I don't see any reason why we should treat Islam differently compared to Christianity. But this unwritten blasphemy law is a fact of life today. And I think in general, I mean, it's not just about Islam. I think it's a broader issue. And if you look at Freedom House, Reporters Without Borders, The Economist Freedom Index, and other surveys on the status of freedom of expression, you can see that within the past 10, 15 years, we've seen a gradual decline in the support for freedom of expression around the world. And I think the new worrying trend is that this is also happening in liberal democracies like Canada, Denmark, Germany, France, and the United States.
And one thing, Flemming, that we've obviously discussed here is that idea of free expression. And one thing that I haven't really read you comment on yet is this idea of fake news. I had even forgotten the Charlie Hebdo and all the world leaders, standing there in Paris behind the huge banner. I'd forgotten about that. And then not more than 2, 3, 4 years later, all of these leaders are passing their own legislation on fake news or determining what's real. Sort of what is your opinion of this? I mean, having lived in the Soviet Union, having reported at that time, what do you think about this new kind of self-censorship that we might have of fake news or people being designated as fake news? What do you think about that?
In fact, I've written about it. I've written a couple of pieces about that, and it fits very well into my Soviet experience because the dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, the vast majority of them were in fact convicted for disseminating deliberate false information about the Soviet system. So this is a classical tool in a dictatorship to silence dissenting voices, and I was flabbergasted that Germany, Italy, and other countries were willing to go down this path to legislate about what is true and false. I mean, that in Germany and France, they have Holocaust denial laws on the books. I'm against them. I've spoken out against them. But these laws, you can understand them maybe in a historical context, even though I was very much surprised to find out that the vast majority of these laws were in fact passed after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I would have suspected that they had been passed in the 60s or the 50s in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust and the genocide against the Jews of Europe. But it only happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
I think one point on that, because in Austria we have incredibly strict, obviously anti-Holocaust laws.
Yes.
From what it seems, is there was this attempt by many of the political and media elites at the time to sort of wash away, because there had been a lot of ex-Nazis and people who were involved in the SS and things who were in large positions of power, specifically in Austria more so. So it's like it took a while for this kind of shame and guilt to build up before you have these laws, which I think we would agree with you are terrible laws anyway, definitely stifling any kind of free speech. It's not a thing that we're not going to support these views, but it's just about what is the role of the state in sort of saying we're not allowed to say X.
But Yaël, I think it's not only about stifling free speech. I think it's also counterproductive to, if you want to fight the opinions behind this kind of speech. For instance, if you take Muslim immigration to Europe within the past 20 years, many of these people come from countries where Holocaust denial is a fact of life. That's what they are being taught in schools. And then they come to Europe with these convictions, and they are not allowed to air these outrageous opinions. So how are you then going to be able to change them? I mean, I think you will not. I haven't seen any example of people changing their minds just because their opinions were criminalized.
Good point. Yeah, definitely.
So I also think it's in not a very effective way to fight Holocaust denial, even though I understand perfectly well that it's deeply offensive to descendants or living Holocaust survivors to be exposed to this kind of speech. I can understand that it's painful, it's very unpleasant, but I just don't think it's the best way to change people's minds through criminalization of their opinions, as long as they do not imply incitement to violence. And
Mhm.
I don't think Holocaust denial equals incitement to violence in Europe today.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I've kind of always held that the the best disinfectant for a lot of these bad ideas is sunlight, is letting them be seen, letting them be argued against and countered, which leads me very much into my next question, which is what recently happened with the New York Times. For our listeners who maybe didn't know, the New York Times published a op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton arguing that the military should be used to calm the riots. The New York Times has a long history of publishing heads of states, diplomats, sitting senators, very controversial people
Putin.
like Vladimir Putin and Nicolas Maduro um, and other
And the
downright.
leader of the Taliban, in fact.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, members of the Taliban. The editor, the opinion editor, was then fired after backlash as a result of publishing Mr. Cotton's op-ed. So, what is your take on that? That pressure, that push to cancel or fire or punish people for, I mean, I think that Tom Cotton is an idiot, and I think that his op-ed was poorly written and poorly argued, and I think that he's generally wrong. But I appreciated being able to see his point of view in the paper of record for the US. So what's your take on that progression and that culture that's slowly building in American media outlets, but also international media outlets?
Well, I think it's very sad, and it's also frightening. I'm not in the U.S. at the moment, but I spend time in the U.S. every now and then, and there is a very polarized public climate. But I think, and I agree with your criticism of Tim Cotton, that I don't think it would be wise to send in the army. And it also turned out that the demonstrations became more quiet and without deploying the armed forces in the US. But I mean, this is a member of the Senate. It's a politician who is close to President Trump. And his point of view, as far as I understand, is supported by 58% of the US population. I mean, I would like to read that in the paper of record, and I think it's a little bit similar to the Holocaust denial, except for the fact that you don't have high-ranking politicians in Western Europe who are Holocaust deniers today. I mean, these are fringe opinions, but this is a very powerful individual, and if you disagree with him, I think it's important that the readers of the New York Times have the opportunity to read what he thinks and then argue against him. And it reminds me a little bit of the Catholic Church in 1500s, 1600s Europe, where the Catholic Church for decades and centuries, they killed heretics, or they banned any kind of dissent. And then finally, when Martin Luther ascended and came forward with an alternative interpretation of the Bible, the Catholics had very little to counter his arguments with, because everything had turned into dogma. We are right because we are right. This is the truth because we know it is the truth. Why? You lose the ability to make your case in a coherent and well articulated way if you don't provide space to opinions with which you disagree. And then it just turns into dogma. And then when you finally are confronted and there's no other way to go, you are not able to make your case. So it's, and that's also one of the reasons why I think it's wrong to criminalize Holocaust denial. You have to exercise your arguments against the people with whom you disagree. Otherwise, you lose your ability to make a coherent case against the opinions that you don't like. I mean, this is classical John Stuart Mill on Liberty, chapter 2, I think. But the climate is so polarized in the United States, and when you, I think the way it was framed within the New York Times was, this is a matter of life and death. This is a matter of security of our employees. But this is also the way a dictatorship and authoritarian regime argues. They always play the security card and say we have to, without making any, analogies between the New York Times or a dictatorship. I'm not saying that. I'm just talking about the mental processes that are going on here and the way arguments are being framed, because there are dissenters within the New York Times who have been able to voice their disagreement in the opinion pages. Bret Stephens and Rod Stewart, classical conservative voices. So it's not that everything has been silenced, but this security argument, I think, is very dangerous, because if you turn every question into an issue of life and death, of course you will always say then we have to shut down these voices because it's a matter of life and death, and how can you argue against that? So we had to prioritize security no matter the cost to freedom of expression. And I think you just have to be very, when people are using these arguments, all alarm bells have to ring.
Yeah, you're listening to Consumer Choice Radio. We're speaking with Flemming Rose. He is the author of The Tyranny of Silence. You can find that at your local bookstore or online or wherever else you can support, specifically the website. We'll link to that in all of our show notes. One thing I wanted to bring up, Flemming, is obviously everything with the media, and people are talking about that there might be violence or that these words are violence. I mean, this is incredibly just, all of it is ironic, because you're someone who, as a writer, a journalist, an editor, a translator, it doesn't just face, these fake threats of violence, but real ones. And I know David and I have both been around you, and we've dealt with security details and all the negotiations and things like that. And here we are in 2020, where we're hearing newspaper, people who work at the New York Times who are saying that my security is being threatened because of this op-ed. This is obviously a moral panic, and that's what I want to get your thoughts on.
I think that's a very good description, yes.
And we're very good at that in the United States. We have a moral panic every couple of years. We had vaping just a couple months ago, just a year ago, feels like a world ago. But now we have one that is related to speech and words as violence. And specifically because so many of us have been, again, locked in our homes. We've had a pandemic. We were told by our governments to stay inside, to be responsible. And then we're seeing that at a turn of a hat, there's something that happens that is tragic, that is the death of George Floyd, and these protests that are even in Denmark. I actually read that in Denmark, there were a couple people who had tested positive for corona. So there might be some.
I participated in a demonstration. That's true. This past Sunday.
And this is another thing.
Was because you had the left protested demonstrations against the lockdowns, and then when they wanted to demonstrate for the right cause, then it was no problem. So there was a bit of hypocrisy.
And that was always what shocked me, is that you can fully support the Black Lives Matter movement. You can fully support the protests, but still at the same time acknowledge that COVID-19 doesn't care what you're out on the streets protesting for,
No,
whether it's a
but
good cause at all.
yeah, but I think you have different opinions. I mean, we get new knowledge as we move along. I think nobody knows everything about COVID-19, how people are infected, how serious it is, and or not serious. But I think you have to be consistent in your arguments when you talk about lockdown and public gatherings. You can't say it just because I'm demonstrating for the right cause, then I have to have a right to violate the lockdown, and I don't have that right if I'm protesting for the wrong cause. I just want people to be consistent.
And there's probably going to be way more of this, obviously. And there's kind of a reckoning that's happening. And I bring this up because this is happening not just in the United States, but also in Europe. There's a lot of conversations about race and religion and the rights of minorities. And it's as if it's not a real conversation. It's sort of being forced. And there is a great, little L liberal way to discuss these things in a very open democratic fashion. But what we're seeing seems to me like very much like you prescribed in your book. It's this kind of idea that people are now self-censoring and following along with a certain narrative that they're not allowed to criticize. And we see it in the elite media, and that doesn't necessarily affect Joe Blow and someone who might be working in their 9-to-5 job, but it's getting more serious. You might end up with a circumstance where all of our jobs might be threatened because of a certain thought or something we have in mind. And I think that's very much part of your thesis of the book.
Yes, but I think, I think it has to do with human nature. And one of the things I've learned over the past 15 years is that free speech or tolerance, they are not the default positions of human nature. Democracy, tolerance, freedom of expression, they are in fact experiments that in many ways goes against human nature. And in many cases, people's instinctive reaction to speech that they don't like is to shut it down. So freedom of expression and tolerance are a matter of practice and education, and it's not easy. It's painful, but I think it's the only way that humanity has discovered to manage diversity and disagreement without resorting to violence, intimidation, and threats. And it means not only free speech for me, but also for thee. But usually it's only for me, but not for people with whom I disagree. And I think here also in the New York Times story, and in general, you have this herd mentality that has been reinforced by social media and everybody sitting at home maybe, identity politics and things like that. And it's sometimes it feels good to be part of a group. Yeah, you feel that you belong. It's also important part of human nature. You have this sense of community and things like that. And it's never easy to go against, the grain, to speak out in a group where you know that what you're going to say now is going to make people uncomfortable, and maybe people will look at you and say this guy is crazy. Or so I think what we need to understand is the importance of protecting dissent in any group. Students for Liberty or libertarians, we all have, no matter where we are, we have this instinct that it's difficult to accept dissenting opinions, and we have this herd mentality, and we always have to remind ourselves that social psychology studies, in fact, shows that that if you are able to create space for dissent, you will reach better solutions to the problems you are facing. But this goes against human nature, and we have to learn it and relearn it over and over again. It's never a settled issue, and it's also why freedom of expression, you can never take it for granted. It's not nature, it's culture.
And I think that perfectly leads into some of the discussion about COVID-19 and the response, because, and I assume that it was probably somewhat similar in Denmark. It was certainly this way in North America, where anyone who spoke, as you quote, against the grain, was very quickly chastised, or in some instances canceled or deplatformed, simply for saying that there may be another approach, and for maybe questioning, let's say, the model that was designed, and things like that.
Same in Denmark, yeah.
Yeah, so you did have the same
Absolutely.
pushback against those who are critical. I think it just highlights how, and you put it so nicely there, that by allowing for dissent, you can come to better solutions, because you can maybe chip away.
Open your mind, even Tim Cotton, with whom we disagree, dissenting voices, even if they are wrong and stupid and outrageous, they forces us to open our mind and consider other options, and that's very healthy, no matter whether we are confronting an opinion that we deeply dislike.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it goes back to the quote that an enlightened mind is one that can entertain an idea with it without accepting it, which is exactly like Tom Cotton's op-ed, where you can read it. It doesn't mean you're going to accept it, but at least now your opposing viewpoint is, their cards are on the table. You can see what they stand for.
And you can work out a coherent argument to counter it. Instead of just saying, this is so stupid, so I will not even engage with it, which I think is the wrong way. But I saw an opinion writer at the New York Times express exactly that point of view, because Cotton had watered down his opinions a bit compared to the way he expressed them on Twitter.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing that struck me about Tom Cotton is that what he wrote in the New York Times was not even remotely close to the most controversial thing that he has said. I mean, he went so far as to say there should be no quarter for rioters, which is basically military jargon for no prisoners of war, like execute on site, which is pretty wild to hear from a senator. But again, it's one of those things where if he puts his ideas out on paper, we can all read it, we can counter it, we can laugh at it, and think that it's silly, and then better formulate a response.
Maybe even Tim Cotton can learn from that experience. I mean, by exposing his point of view to the New York Times readers and the kind of responses he received, he may correct his line of argumentation a little bit. And that's in fact what he did through this editing process. He made a distinction between rioters and protesters, which he apparently didn't do on his Twitter.
But he's still kind of emboldened as well by kind of the backlash. Now he feels as if, more people are on his side. And I think they even commissioned polls, which again, I don't know who does these polls, but now that it's like, oh yeah, the majority of the American public is all in favor of this. Flemming, there has to be some positive things that we're looking forward to. You got to give us something that we can see as rosy. I think you've lived through darker days, no doubt, having covered a lot of the old East-West divide. So is there great positive news that you think we can cling to in the 21st century and things we can be excited about?
Oh, I think there is a lot of, positive news out there. We shouldn't forget that, if you read Steven Pinker or Matt Ridley or my Swedish colleague at the Cato Institute, Johan Norberg, the world has never been in a better shape. I mean, we are living longer, we are more healthy, we are richer than ever. We live more equal lives in spite of all the inequality that still exists. But and I would say for myself, I mean, I feel privileged, even though I live with security. I have the Danish state behind me. If I had been living behind the Iron Curtain and was up against the Soviet state, I would be in a very different situation. I didn't lose my job. I didn't have to immigrate. So I think life is pretty cool. I enjoy it. I hope you do too.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing that we've always kind of highlighted on our show is we certainly complain about a lot of things, but it is important to sit back and also remember that in terms of human history, there has never been a better time to be alive. And the folks that you mentioned, like Norberg and Matt Ridley, really do highlight that. So in wrapping up, Flemming, what is next for you? What are you working on? What is new and exciting in your life, and what does a post-COVID Flemming Rose look like?
Well, right now I'm working on a big article for Cato about content moderation, the big issue on digital platforms. What kind of rules should we apply for regulating speech on digital platforms? Facebook, Twitter, Google, Reddit, they all have community standards, community rules, and Facebook has just appointed an oversight board, and my Cato colleague, John Samples, has been appointed to Facebook's oversight board. And the debate right now is about international human rights law. Should we apply international human rights law? And there are very powerful and influential voices in the US and around the world making the case for international human rights standards as the standard for regulating speech online. And I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical. I would prefer a First Amendment standard for regulating speech online. And I think there is a profound difference, especially when it comes to so-called hate speech that you can criminalize in Canada, in Austria, in most countries around the world, but not in the United States. It's not because I'm in favor of hateful speech, but I think it's not a legal category, and it's very easy to use as a tool to silence dissenting voices. So I'm trying to write a paper and make the case for First Amendment standards as the standard for regulating speech online. And then I'm working on a short book about, it was originally about multiculturalism and free speech for graduate students, but I think it's so many things happened since 2015. So I think I'm focusing on identity, diversity, and culture as three different discourses that are being used as veiled censorship tools. That if you criticize people's identity, if you criticize the concept of diversity, the way it is being used, or people's culture, then you don't have a right to freedom of expression. To put it very, simply, but it's a complicated argument. But I think these discourses are being used to delegitimize criticism, and they undermine freedom of expression and tolerance, which I think tolerance, in fact, is a key concept that we have to recover. and reintroduce in order to be able to manage the growing diversity in our societies of religion, ethnicity, and culture without violence, intimidations, and threats. But unfortunately, it's not a popular concept in certain quarters. But I think we need to rehabilitate it in order for diversity to survive in the 21st century.
Well, that's a great way to close. In the spirit of tolerance, thank you for tolerating our two ugly mugs for the better part of an hour.
That was a difficult task, David.
Okay, well, we appreciate it. We'll certainly keep an eye out for your latest works, and we hope to have you back on the show down the road to discuss.
And buy this book, Tyranny of Silence, Flemming Rose.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us.
Good luck with everything.